Need to keep all those folks that are sick and going through various treatments, keep them in our prayers. Right offhand, I can't remember everybody. Lisa's one that I know of. Brother Terry told me that Donnie's nephew, they've been doing different treatments on him and one surgery, and so far everything is holding pretty good. Also, we need to keep Linda in our prayers. Loss of Brother Grant. I'm quite sure that there's a lot of folks traveling today, with it being Easter Sunday, as they say, so keep those in our prayers. Is there anyone else that we need to?
He's having a mobility problem this weekend. He's been real weak and he used a walker. He's better this morning, but his balance is still.
Oh, okay. Keep Brother.
I said periods of immobility coming.
Okay. Keep Brother Bryant in our prayers. Anyone else? Brother Mayfield, would you lead us in a prayer then before we begin, please?
Dear Father, at this time we come giving you thanks for everything that you do. We ask you bless upon all those mentioned here that are sick. We ask you to place your healing hand upon them. Be with those traveling, give them safe journey to and from their destination. Be with us and the teachers now who are about to study the Bible. We take what is taught here in our daily life.
Amen. 2 Chronicles chapter 21. 2 Chronicles chapter 21. Last week we had gone through Elisha, the prophet, spent all our time on him talking about a few things. We're going to talk about him a little bit today, but we're going to start with Jehoram. By the way, it's lesson 14. If you need a copy, there's a few on the banister outside. Ahaziah and Elisha will be the ones that we talk about today. Now, as last week, I'm not going to go through questions and answers per se, but everything that we talk about, we'll be answering those questions. So if you've got your sheet with you and look at it, you can tell as we go along. There will be some that I may emphasize, but since we're dealing with the first section, specifically chapter 21, last week we talked about Elisha. This week we're going to be talking about the southern kingdom in Judah. And last week, Jehoshaphat would have been the king. There was that transition we talked about, putting it in a time frame of 853 BC down for a few years into the 840s BC. Well, today we're going to be talking about Jehoram, and when did he start reigning as king in Judah? He is Jehoshaphat's son, but when did he start reigning? Roughly in 853, he was co-regent. In other words, he co-reigned with his father for 5 years. So he starts his sole reign of Judah in about 848. And he goes to 841. And in 841, that's when Ahaziah takes over. But let's just start and read some in chapter 21, and we'll discuss a few things, because in this chapter and the beginning of the next chapter, there are a couple of issues that if you don't sit back and think and use some common sense and reason, you can get confused over them. So to start with, verse 1, now Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers, meaning he died, was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Jehoram his son reigned in his stead. Now we're talking about starting his reign here in about 848, as the Jehoram as the sole reign here. And he had brethren, the sons of Jehoshaphat, Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, and Michael, and Shephatiah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel. And their father gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things, with fenced cities in Judah. But the kingdom gave he to Jehoram, because he was the firstborn. Now, if you look at your question and answer sheet, we just answered some of the question there about what did he give his sons and who he gave the kingdom to and things of that nature. Now, in verse 4, it says, when Jehoram was risen up to the kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and slew all his brethren with the sword, and divers also of the princes of Israel. Now, to put things in context, was Jehoshaphat a good king or a bad king? Relatively speaking, he was on the good end of it, right? Well, now his son Jehoram here, what does he do? He kills his brothers. What category does that put him in? I'd say it put him in a bad one. Now, I think, at least for me, some of the next text tells us why he is the way he is. It says Jehoram was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Okay, remember I said he reigned 5 years with his father, and then the 8 years here, that's talking about his sole reign when he was in 848 to 841, when he was the only king. He wasn't with anybody. He reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Here, so we don't get confused, when we mention Israel in this passage, what are we talking about? Because before the divided kingdom, wasn't everything referred to as Israel? All the Jewish nation, the Hebrews, as they was moving, it was all the Jewish nation. Well, after the kingdom divided, the section we're in right now, what does it mean when it says that he was in the way of the kings of Israel? Yes, sir, Brother Golden. That is correct. So he is now not walking in the way of his father and of the kings of Judah, those through the line of David. He's walking through those that were set up by Rehoboam on Jeroboam, whichever Boam. Anyway, the northern 10 tribes. Now here is something that gets specific about the whys. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel, like as did the house of Ahab. Ahab was a king of the northern 10 tribes. Why would he follow the way of Ahab instead of following the way of his own father? Like as the house of Ahab, for he had the daughter of Ahab to wife. Who was Ahab's wife? Ahab was a bad guy because he married Jezebel, and he set up all the Baal worship and everything because Jezebel was a Phoenician, and he assumed their religion instead of the Jewish religion. And Jezebel was an evil woman. Ahab was a bad man, and now their daughter marries a king in the south, in Judah. And what did the Old Testament strictly tell the Jews not to do, and why? Not to marry the foreign women, the outsiders, because They would lead them to idolatry, and we see that starting way back when, and it all came to pass. And he wrought that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, if we'll look at verse 11, that tells us the evil here. We'll skip over to 11, and then we'll come back to 7. Moreover, he made high places in the mountains of Judah and caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to commit fornication and compel Judah thereto. So he was not only an evil person, but he encouraged and coerced or to whatever extent he could for the whole Judah then to become bad. Verse 7 tells us that the Lord would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David. That's one of your questions also, why he didn't destroy. And he had promised to give light to him and to his sons forever. Now, this next section, starting with verse 8. In his days, the Edomites revolted from under the dominion of Judah and made themselves a king. Time out. What has Edom got to do with Judah? Where was Edom? Was it a part of the 10 tribes or the 2 tribes of that congeal? If you'll look at your map, and I'll try to do this backwards so you can get a good idea of it. If I look at the map, it's west and east, so I'm going to flip it around, and you're going to be looking at me, and this is the east side. Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel is here, and Judah is right below that. Moab is over here, and right at the bottom of the Dead Sea would be Edom. So why does Edom, that's not a part of the 12 tribes, why are they now revolting? How did this all come about? We'll need to go back to 1 Chronicles on that. If we look at 1 Chronicles chapter 18, I'm sorry? 1 Chronicles 18, verses 12 and 13. Moreover, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, slew of the Edomites in the valley of Salt 18,000, and he put garrisons in Edom, and all the Edomites became David's servants. Thus the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. So back then, they had, in essence, captured Edom and put them as servants under David, under the United Kingdom, and they were still a part of that, and now they revolt and make themselves a king, which they hadn't had a king during this period of time. Then Jehoram went forth with his princes and all his chariots with him, and he rose up by night and smote the Edomites, which compassed him and the captains of the chariots. So the Edomites revolted from under the hand of Judah unto this day. The same time also did Libnah revolt from under his hand, because he had forsaken the Lord God of his fathers. Who can tell me anything about Libnah? Okay, Libnah was a city in Judah. Let's go back to Joshua on this one. Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10, verses 29 and 30. Then Joshua passed from Makkedah and all Israel with him unto Libnah, and fought against Libnah, and the Lord delivered it also, and the king thereof into the hand of Israel, and he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein he let none remain, but did unto the king thereof as he did unto the king of Jericho. Also from there, if we look at Joshua chapter 21 and verse 18, and Anathoth with, it would be right on the page, Anathoth with her suburbs, and Almon with her suburbs, 4 cities. All the cities of the children of Aaron the priest were 13 cities with their suburbs. And I must have missed part of it, because it also talks about back up to 13. I can't make out my numbers between 3 and 8 without my glasses. Verse 13 in Joshua 21. Thus they gave to the children of Aaron the priest Hebron with her suburbs to be a city of refuge for the slayer, and Libnah with her suburbs. So even though it was a city in Judah, it had been given to the Levites, the priest, and now because it was basically run by and organized by the religious group, the Levites, when Jehoram is not doing what he's supposed to, they rebel, they revolt. So it's a city within the country that is revolting, along with the Edomites, a country outside this group. Questions, comments? Have we got you totally confused? Or just a little bit? Then when we go down to verse 12, there came a writing to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of David the father, because thou hast not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat thy father, nor in the ways of Asa king of Judah, but hast walked in the ways of the king of Israel, and hast made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to go a whoring, like to the whoredoms of the house of Ahab, and also hast slain thy brothers of thy father's house, which were better than thyself. Behold, with a great plague will the Lord smite thy people and thy children and their wives and thy goods. And thou shalt have great sickness by disease of the bowels, until thy bowels fall out by reason of the sickness day by day. Remember, at this point, Elijah is already gone. He was taken up and gone. So here that says that a writing came from Elijah. So Elijah passed this along, and it came to him after Elijah was gone, predicting or forecasting what kind of death that Jehoram would die. And verse 16 says, Moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians. All right, if we're looking at that map again, this time we've got Israel and Judah on this side. Philistines are over on this side next to the coast. Now, if it's talking about the Arabians that were near Ethiopia, that would be, if you remember where Edom was that we tried to point out, Arabia would be just below Edom, and then the Ethiopians would be down in the lower region there. But the Lord stirred up those, and they came up unto Judah and brake into it and carried away all the substance. Again, this is answering one of your questions. They carried away all the substance that was found in the king's house, and his sons also, and his wives, so there was never a son left him, save Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons. So when the Philistines and the Arabians came in, they basically destroyed the place, went in and took everything that was Jehoram's, killed it, except for the youngest son, Jehoahaz. Now, I said there might be some confusion, because if we look down into the next chapter, it says that the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his stead. Well, time out. What did verse 17 say? Jehoahaz was his youngest son. Ahaziah in chapter 22. How do we reconcile the two? Is one right and one wrong? They're both right. He had at least three names that we're aware of. He was Azariah, Jehoahaz, and Ahaziah. So that there is no conflict there. That's all good. In verse 18, and after all this, the Lord smote him in his bowels with an incurable disease, and it came to pass that in the process of time, after the end of 2 years, his bowels fell out by reason of the sickness, so he died of sore disease. And his people made no burning for him like the burning of his father. What does that mean? We answered the question about how he died, but what does it mean that his people made no burning for him like the burning of his father? It would be like us today having an official lion state. It is a great honor that they pay to some high ranking person who has passed away. But here, because he was evil, they just didn't pay him that homage. I'm sorry? I thought I heard it. Verse 20 then says, 32 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years and departed without being desired. Howbeit they buried him in the city of David, but not in the sepulchre of the kings. Again, dishonor, because he was not a good person. He was an evil person. And to no one's sorrow. Chapter 22, any questions or comments on chapter 21? Because we're going to refer back to it here in just a second on another point that I want to clear up. Or at least to me, it needs to be cleared. We've already discussed Ahaziah having several names. His youngest was then made king in his stead, for the band of men that came with the Arabians to the camp had slain all the eldest. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. And we've talked about the name. Now look at the second verse here. 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign. I saw one. Is there any more frowns? Let's back up to the previous chapter, verse 20. 32 years old was he when he began to reign. He reigned in Jerusalem 8 years and departed without being desired. Jehoram was 40 years old when he died. How could his son, Ahaziah, begin to reign at the age of 42? He would have had to have been born 2 years before his father. Right? So what's going on? I ask a question, it's your turn to talk. Let's see if we can make some sense out of it. Look at 2 Kings chapter 8. In 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 25 and 26, says, in the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab of Israel, did Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. 22 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri, king of Israel. Well, Kings has 22 years old. Chronicles has 42 years old. Which one is right? How do we reconcile? It's quite obvious that there is absolutely no way that if we're talking about the same person, that both can be correct. And we are talking about the same person because if you recall what I read in Kings, if we go on down in verse 2 of chapter 22 of 2 Chronicles, it says his mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. We are talking about the same person. It is impossible for him to be older than his father. So that means that in this particular place, 42 years old has been mistranslated. If you look at some of the other versions of the Bible, some that are not taken from the text that the King James, New King James is taken from, it references 22, NIV, ESV, and a few others. Also, in study, the Syriac and the Arabic manuscripts have 22. Some of the Septuagint versions have 20 and others the 42. But if you just use some common sense and go through here with Kings and another place or two talking about his age being 22 and knowing that it's impossible for him to be older than his father, it just makes sense that this was mistranslated and he was 22 years of age. Now, another particular thing that we have here is that it says that his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. If you recall, when we talked about his mother, his father, Jehoram, had married who? Ahab's daughter, not Ahab's sister, because Omri was Ahab's father. Why would that then say here that Omri was the daughter, Athaliah was the daughter of Omri, if in fact she was the daughter of Ahab? Was the granddaughter. And if you recall from a lesson when we first started this, we were talking about that in Jewish culture, this time frame, they would refer to their kin as sons and daughters, even if they were grand, great, or whatever, and back to father. And even if you go into the New Testament, particularly in Matthew 1 and verse 1, what does it say about Jesus? It calls him the son of David. Had to go a long way back to get to the son of David, but they use that phrase in a manner of honor because Omri of who he was set things up. And Ahab, his son, and then Athaliah, Ahab's daughter. And that's how all of that fits together. Questions, comments? Brother Terry, help me out. I think I'm bailing water here. Okay. Anything else on these particular sections? Okay. Yes, sir. Well, how would you answer that? Well, it would take a while to uncover everything and get back to it. But scribes back in the old days were not infallible, were they? They had gotten polished to the point where a scribe, when they had it numbered so he knew the middle word, middle letter, number of letters to the page, line, etc. And if a manuscript was not perfect, they would burn it. Well, if that's the case, then let's get on back. How can we say there's a mistake here if we just said that everything was perfect? And it goes back to how many manuscripts there are, and a lot of the differences in the manuscripts. I just mentioned the Syriac, the Arabic, the Septuagint was the Latin version, and where did they get their information from which one? And if you go back to the old Hebrew, which was tied in with another language, it's even more confusing. And the letters, I don't speak Hebrew or don't write Hebrew, Brother Terry might, but it's my understanding from what I read that the letters 20 and 40 are so similar that it would be easy to confuse them. And if we look at this and go back and say, well, in this verse he was 22, in this verse he was 22, his mother was, well, you got at least two times that you're told that he's 22, and now this one says he's 42, and it's just, to me, an obvious way of saying that one spot had an incorrect date. I'm sorry? Yeah. That's the way I would go. Brother Terry, could you add to that? Anything else? Got much time? We got a few minutes left. Okay. So we have gone through chapter 22. We've gotten through 2 verses of it. Let's look at 2 more. That's going to be in your questions on page 2. Said he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to do wickedly. Moreover, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father to his destruction. Well, his father wasn't all that great either, but with his mother being his counselor, Ahab and Jezebel's daughter, did he have much chance of being a good person? And my answer would be no. So question 2 on this says, describe his character. We just told you who his mother was, his counselor. So describe the character of Ahaziah in just a few verses that we've read. If he walked in the ways of Ahab, what does that tell you? Evil. And what did Ahab do? Other than marry Jezebel, the Phoenician, and go to her religion, what did he do to get things going all wrong? He set up temples in the high places, Baal worship, and just totally led the northern 10 tribes astray. And now a king of the south, king of Judah, marries one of those from the north that had been corrupted. So, questions, comments? The next section we're going to look at is dealing with Elisha and the Shunammite woman, and that will be in 2 Kings chapter 8. Now, this is when Elisha is prophesying about famines and things of that nature. And what we're going to do is read the first 6 verses of chapter 8, and then we'll go back and answer some questions. Then spake Elisha unto the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise, and go thou and thine household, and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn, for the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. And it came to pass at the 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth to cry unto the king for her house and for her land. And the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha hath done. And it came to pass, as he was telling the king how he had restored a dead body to life, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life cried to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha had restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, Restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field since the day that she left the land, even until now. So in that section, the first question would be, what was the duration of the famine that was prophesied by Elisha? 7 years. And how did this compare to the famine that occurred during the days of Elijah? That one dealt with famine too and hard times. Where did the Shunammite woman go during the famine? Land of the Philistines. When the famine ended and she returned to Israel, what was her plea to the king, and why did the king restore her property? She wanted what was hers back. She wanted her house and her land back. And why did the king give it back to her? Because of the prophet. Gehazi had told him, this is the woman that son was brought back from the dead. And so the king probably thought that she was special, or at least he didn't want to make the prophet mad. And what did he do in addition to just restoring her property to her? Now remember, the prophet told her what was going to happen, and she went and lived in another land. After the famine was over, which was 7 years in duration, she came back. So she was absent from the land 7 years. And what does the king tell the officer to do? Restore all her property and the 7 years worth of goods that would have been if she had stayed on the land. That's pretty good recompense for leaving your land and coming back, isn't it? So the king was apparently trying to do the right thing and do what was good. Now we get to, well, we're going to get into this next week a little bit more. But I want to skip ahead instead of going through the questions here. As we get on down into chapter 22, Ahaziah, how long was he king? That's not on your questions, but if you'd read ahead a little bit, he was only king for 1 year. And then he was killed. And we're going to find out that his mother sort of usurped the throne for about 7 years and tried to rule. Maybe we ought to wait till next week to get into that a little bit more in detail. So back to the questions. If you've got the section on Elisha and Hazael, says, where did Elisha go and who was sick? And this is in, we're in 2 Kings chapter 8, and this is in verse 7. It says, Elisha came to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, was sick. And it was told him, saying, the man of God is come hither. So Elisha went to Damascus. Ben-Hadad was the king that was sick. Verses 8 and 9, the king said unto Hazael, take a present in thine hand, and go and meet the man of God, and require of the Lord by him, saying, shall I recover from this disease? So question 2 is, what message did Ben-Hadad send? We just answered that. We also answered that how he received the message. The next question is, what was Elisha's reply? Remember, he had asked if he would recover, and Elisha tells him what? Anybody read ahead, study? Pardon? Tell him he will recover. But what else did Elisha know that he didn't tell him to tell him? He's going to die. Tell him he's going to live, he'll recover, but he's going to die. Brother Terry was just saying that there's a question in that in essence, Elisha told him to lie to the king, tell him he would recover when he knew he wouldn't. And fortunately, I was saved by the bell, and I'm going to let Brother Clunch answer that one Wednesday night before he starts his class. Thank y'all.